The greatest rock and roll band in the world. They're incredible. Let's hear it from the Spaniards.
Dartford, Kent, 1962. Not having seen each other since primary school, Keith Richards and Mick Jagger happened to bump into each other at the local train station. Mick was carrying new rock and blues records. Keith, also an avid music lover, only stopped to talk to Mick when he saw what he was carrying.
He's got Best of Muddy Waters and Rockin' at the Hops by Chuck Berry under his arm, you know. Hey, man. Nice to see you, but where'd you get the records?
They got reacquainted on the train and the musical partnership had begun. April 1962. Charlie Watts was playing the drums at the Ealing Club. Mick and Keith were in the audience watching Watts and Brian Jones perform Dust My Blues. Mick and Keith were intrigued, but Brian, already with his band members penciled in, didn't ask them to join. After disappointing results, Jones finally auditioned and hired Mick and Keith.
Brian Jones was the Rolling Stones, yeah. Brian named the band, formed the band, rehearsed. It was his idea, everything was him, yeah. He played with Alexis and the band that Alexis had, that Charlie was playing drums in. He actually persuaded Alexis to let him get on stage and play. And he heard an Elmore James record for the first time in his life, which I never heard one until about 65 or something, or 64. He said the whole universe shuddered, you know, when he heard this, you know, that slide thing. He immediately got a slide and started playing, and there he was playing when Mick and Keith first went to see the Alexis Corner band.
The infamous Brian Jones, lead singer of the Rolling Stones, was born to a middle-class family in Cheltenham on the 28th of February 1942. Brian's father was an aircraft designer and his mother a piano teacher. Despite a comfortable suburban lifestyle, Brian's creative urges went against the strict normalcy of his parents' upbringing. This thin relationship was further tested when his sister Pamela died at the age of 3. His mother became even more distant, and so he focused on his studies, passing 9 O-levels and 2 A-levels. At the age of 16, he had already fathered a child with his 14-year-old girlfriend Valerie and was temporarily banished to Europe by his outraged parents. The child was later adopted. Brian further went against his family's high hopes by taking random jobs and at night visiting the Cheltenham jazz clubs. His taste for music grew as fast as his ability to play guitar. .38 Priory Street became an underground hotspot where musicians relaxed after playing gigs. A place where they would discuss groundbreaking American acts such as Elvis Presley. David Reynolds from the Brian Jones fan club introduces us to resident Jane Philby.
Terry Lightfoot's group came here, Chris Barber's group came here,
Wow.
Mick Mulligan's group came here.
Do you think it was because these other bands came down here, trad bands, that would have attracted Brian Jones to visit?
Most likely. Not realising, of course, he was interested in music, but of course, this is obviously, and came and met with all the other people that were interested in music and jazz. Yeah. And, you know, it was, the name would go around, you coming out of Philby's tonight, you know, to the jazz club, you know.
Yeah, that's right.
And that's how Brian obviously came here.
Did it strike you? What sort of a chap did he come over like?
Very shy.
Shy then?
Oh yes, I think so. Well, John Appleby is the author of this particular book, and he loved entertaining as well, and he would have parties down here.
He was very good friends with Brian Jones, wasn't he?
Yes, he was.
Brian would go around and talk to him, almost like deputising for his father.
I think,
Father figure type.
Oh, yes, and John was that sort of father figure to a lot of youngsters. There is a picture of Brian there.
Brian fathered his second child with his new 15-year-old girlfriend early on in their relationship.
What is a young girl made of? Sugar, they say, and spice. What is a young girl made of? Everything that's nice.
He would never prove to be either a reliable husband or father throughout his short life. His father was understandably upset with his son's behaviour, and once again Brian turned to the things he could genuinely enjoy.
Bright as a star of love's sweet mystery, here in my arms, where you should always be. What is a young girl made of while she is in her teens?
It was in the jazz clubs where the burgeoning drug culture took hold, just as the music was shifting in a new direction. After playing with several local bands, Brian ended up in the Ramrods.
I first met Brian, I would think, memory serves me right, 1960. Phil Crowther, who was our lead guitarist then, introduced him to the band and brought him along for a session. He became a full-time member, playing in fact guitar and sax. The Ramrods were playing predominantly rock and roll, a lot of Little Richard, Chuck Berry, that style of thing. Brian had more of a lead actually into blues, and Alexis Corner was the big connection, I think, actually as far as Cheltenham was concerned, when Alexis would come down actually and play. And they got together, and that was very much part of the relationship.
In 1961, blues player Alexis Corner played at the Cheltenham Town Hall, and a smitten Brian Jones would often visit Corner at his London pad, meeting other blues musicians and constantly practicing on his guitar. It wasn't long before Brian had his heart set on forming his own band. 102 Edith Grove, Chelsea. Mick, Brian and Keith were sharing digs in a small cold apartment. They were broke, unhappy and so far unsuccessful. Miserable winter nights were spent wearing all their clothes just to keep them warm. Mick was studying at the London School of Economics while Keith had just finished a course at a local art college. Bill Purves was older than the other band members, but had his own amps and played bass guitar, so he was hired, changing his stage name to Wyman soon after. Drummer Tony Chapman was replaced with Charlie Watts, and the lineup was now complete. Despite their niche American blues act, Brian managed to book venues in jazz clubs. The Rolling Stones' first unofficial manager was Giorgio Gramosci. His enthusiasm paid off, and the Stones soon had a large following of young adults eager to discover the blues sound.
The original members?
Yes, one of the original members.
What were you doing before you joined?
Well, just sort of bumming around waiting for something to happen, really. You know, I had quite a few jobs and I was trying to get a band going, but it was unsuccessful until I met up with Mick and Keith.
In 1963, Andrew Loog Oldham took over as the Stones' manager.
I love Rolls Royces. I love sort of big flashy manors and things like that. You know, I'd sort of love to have big dogs and go shooting and have yachts and things like that.
Andrew Oldham and I were partners in virtually everything we did. Publicity, record production, and we later went on and founded and formed and ran in a very haphazard but very amusing sort of way with Immediate Records.
He had this enormous ability to put his head above the turret and say A, B, C, D, HGI, and you go, gee, I wish I'd thought of that. What he set as the pictures, the way to do publicity, became the yardstick right through to today.
Andrew had this real talent for sort of making a splash and a fuss and centering attention on you, which would have taken us a lot longer probably if we hadn't have had someone like Andrew. And he was younger than any of us. So he had a very young and very, very irreverent attitude.
I'd done the publicity on Love Me Do with the Beatles, and then he took over and did the next record, and then we started to put all our publicity packages together.
When Andrew decided he wanted to manage the Rolling Stones, he needed a partner that had, I think it was a London council license, because at that time an agent was an employer and you had to have an employment license. The minimum age for those employment licenses was 21. So Andrew needed somebody that already had an existing license, and he found Eric Easton, which he later regretted. They were managed, apparently, at the time by Giorgio Gramosci, who went on to manage the Yardbirds. And Andrew obviously made a very good presentation to Mick that he should have Andrew as his manager. And Giorgio got second best with the Yardbirds.
People didn't know what it was when they heard it, you see. The audience just stood there like completely shocked and didn't know how to dance to it or how to react to it, because they never heard the songs, never heard the rhythms. It was bizarre. So we used to sit on stools and smoke cigarettes and drink beers and just play amongst ourselves. And if the audience clapped or something, we kind of looked round and, ah. And if they didn't, we just talked amongst ourselves and carried on. It was a bizarre experience.
If Andrew had not met and taken on the Rolling Stones, I think they would have broken up in 6 months, a year. He would never have heard of the Rolling Stones. Originally it was Brian Jones's band. They were a blues band, and they were playing blues clubs, blues nights, so they went down very well because they loved their blues. Andrew's vision was totally different. He wanted that rock icon. He wanted Mick up front. He encouraged Mick, he taught Mick, he guided him, he persuaded him. He did everything he could to get Mick to be up front. And that's what Mick did. Mick grabbed it. And that's why it became the type of band they were. Mick led from the front. Keith was tucked in behind. They were fabulous. And Mick's whole thing in the early days was to get the crowd to jump on the stage. And then we ran. If they didn't jump, shame.
Andrew knew from the very beginning that he had the potential in Mick Jagger to turn him into an international rock and roll star. Andrew said to me, "You see that singer? I'm going to make him a superstar." And do you know something? He sure did. And it became obvious to Andrew that there was a market out there that wanted something that the people could rebel against their parents.
Andrew wanted to make them really the bad boys of rock and roll.
When I first met the Stones, Andrew told me that Brian Jones was the leader of the band. But you see, this is where Andrew's iconic establishment vis-a-vis the media, which was called the press then, came into play. Andrew realised that Mick Jagger was the star. Whether he was the leader of the band or not, it didn't mean a thing to Andrew. And everything had to be focused on Mick, because to focus on 5 people was too big a spread. And already he could see that with the Beatles, the split between the media for Paul and John was so diverse, it was cutting out the amount of extra publicity or the control of the publicity that they should have had.
What Andrew did is he took what basically was a blues band and turned them into the most phenomenal pop, really rock and roll band. That's the real key. Their rock and roll was pop for popular.
The Stones stage performance was really Mick and Keith. Initially, Brian called the shots, but then they decided that Brian had to toe the line, so to speak. So one night they cut off his microphone. Another night they put his microphone on the other side of the stage. And it was a part of a realization that Brian was not the leader. The people weren't interested in Brian, and although Brian believed he was the most important member of the group, it was a part of the campaign to focus everything on Mick. It became obvious to Andrew that there was a market out there that wanted something that the people could rebel against their parents. And Andrew just encouraged them to wear their own clothes, and they got slowly, or decidedly, rougher and harder. And that's how the image got developed. Oh, a quick summing up of the band members. Charlie was fabulous. Eartone, could you ring Shirley and tell her I'm going to be late? Bill Wyman didn't speak to me, but then he didn't speak to other people either. Very quiet. Brian tried to make me his friend in his battle with Mick. Keith was great when he was on his own, wouldn't say much when he was with the band. And Mick was Mick. He was a great learner and a great manipulator right from the beginning.
Brian attempted to write his own songs, but without encouragement or praise, his confidence began to desert him. He found solace the only way he knew how, through drugs, alcohol and sex.
Brian Jones was the original leader of the band. It didn't fit with the way Andrew knew he had to project the band. The band fell in behind Andrew in, yeah, we'll turn his microphone off, we'll move his microphone to the other side of the stage. All little items that could have been cleared up if Brian had stood his ground. It was those early things that probably knocked the stuffing, or the whatever we call it today, out of Brian that caused the problems later on. He couldn't cope with the press coverage, which was all centred on Mick. So little things happened. He was not told about recording sessions. He would be picked up late for the transport for a gig. When he pushed it the other way and decided not to be there and would say, I'll be an hour later, they just left him behind.
His girlfriend Linda bore him a son, his fourth child. Shortly afterwards, another sometime girlfriend, Dawn Malloy, announced she was expecting Brian's child.
I believe that Brian Jones's act about being shy may have been how he was in the beginning, but he soon developed that into a form of, I suppose you'd call it a chat-up line. He was certainly not shy. Brian, like most of us, had a very healthy appetite for young ladies. The days of safe sex didn't come round at that time. And I can remember there were girls saying that Brian was the father of their child, and I spoke to Brian about it. And I arranged for them to come to the office from wherever they came from. And I can remember, I think there were 4 young ladies who'd had 4 children individually, and they're all dressed with their, you know, the Brian Jones fringe blonde haircut. There's no doubting they all looked like his children, whether they were or not or other. But I remember Brian walking into the office, and I said, right, Brian, they're all here waiting to see. And Brian walked into the room, and they went, oh, hello, Brian, how are you? And he turned and walked out the room and said, I've got to talk to you. I said, what? He said, I've never met any of these women in my life.
I would never tell somebody else to go out and do the same thing I did, unless they know they've got some money or something to support them. So, but I'd never regretted it. I'd never regret having Mark.
I'm quite sure that Brian was the father of all those children.
Question, I haven't found a girl I want to marry. In any case, the whole prospect of marriage rather frightens me. It's rather like signing a contract. Whenever I sign a contract for anything, I want to read it carefully, because, you know, you're signing a part of you away, and when you get married, I feel that you're signing your whole life away.
Apparently, at night, he could be very violent with the women.
Brian's drug abuse was out of control, and personally I never wanted to see him in the evening at all, and nor did Andrew. There were several occasions when he'd beaten up some girl, and I had to get a lawyer to rescue him from being held overnight, I presume.
I think Brian Jones, in his own way, created sex, drugs, and rock and roll with a bit of violence.
This is why I have no sort of concrete ideas on the future, because I really don't know when things are going to come to an end or what's going to happen.
In terms of rivalry between the Beatles and the Stones, any rivalry was created by the respective management offices. We would check the dates of their releases. The record companies wouldn't do it because one was with EMI, one's with Decca, and they didn't speak to each other, but we did it because we didn't want to clash. But that was all PR manipulation. Record company chart results became important. Did you go straight in at #1 and things like that? And a lot of that was Andrew. We would speak to all the record companies to work out the dates of everybody else's releases. And we would, you know, remember we published the Beach Boys as well. We broke the Beach Boys. We manipulated that record in England by buying it into the charts before EMI had actually manufactured it. And we did that for 2 weeks before they pulled their finger out and got the record out, even though they had a release date for 3 weeks back. So yes, we worked on release dates
to make sure you didn't clash and overlap. But that was normally done between managers and record companies rather than the artists. The artists knew it was being done because everybody wanted to be number one. I'd worked at Decca, and I knew the ins and outs of retail and shipping records and everything. By the time we got to Little Red Rooster, we developed it to a fine art, and we had a massive pre-sale, so the record went straight in at number one. It was only a little later that we had two guys called Mick and John that had a housewives buying team all over the country. We did develop the idea of sending records to dance halls, as they were then, to play on the record sessions. In fact, the first Beatles record of Love Me Do, I was working PR by day and working for Mecca by night with Jimmy Savile. So I got Brian Epstein to give us some records, and we sent them to all the Mecca ballrooms. And Jimmy got very angry with me that I'd sent them to all the top-ranked ballrooms. But it was such a good dance record, Love Me Do. It was played in the dance halls, and it picked up a few radio plays. It wasn't as big as all the other records became, but it became that stamp. This is a Beatles sound. But we did it by working through the dance halls. So from that point on, we were always concerned, could you dance to a record? If you could, get it into the dance halls, and then obviously later on it became discos and everything else. So there was a combination of marketing, which today some people would call manipulation. The buying of records in certain shops that we knew were the chart shops, yes, that was manipulating. You must remember that a number one in those days was a real number one. It wasn't just you went to number one and you'd sold 300, 400, 500,000 singles. Today, you're lucky to do it on 30 or 40,000.
Brian Jones became a major, major problem. Initially, it was his band. Andrew took Mick, pushed him up front, encouraged him. Didn't really encourage Brian at all. Was party to many tricks to downgrade Brian.
Brian walks into the studio expecting all the band to be there. They'd actually recorded the track the day before. And there, leaning against his guitar amp, was a note saying, play only on these 24 bars, nothing else. And again, it was like horror, because they'd done the whole song without him, and they didn't actually want to be in the studio with him.
But downgrading Brian meant massive loss of self-esteem. It was a gradual process of moving Brian to one side. Mick had been encouraged to grab it all for himself, and then when Mick had taken the bull by the horns, Andrew then worked on Keith to make him like the number 1.5 guy. I would say once Andrew realised the potential he had in moulding Mick into the focal point of the band and pushing him up front, he realised he had a casualty in Brian Jones because Brian wouldn't conform and fit in. And as far as Andrew was concerned, he was out.
We were playing Berlin on the first Rolling Stones European tour. And Andrew very quickly noticed that the audience was 98% male. You couldn't recognise a female in there. So Andrew said to him, goose step back across the stage. Mick would always take it one step further. So Mick not only goose stepped, he raised his right arm in salute.
180 cars were wrecked at the car park, and rock and roll concerts were banned from Berlin for the next 25 years. Now that appealed to Andrew, and the fan base got bigger and bigger and bigger because it appealed to that element that wanted to revolt against their parents, against everybody.
The Stones did 2 tours of America where we lost money. The third tour, we broke even. Satisfaction was the real break record. I can remember we were driving along the Pacific Coast Highway and we punched a station and it played Satisfaction. We punched the next button, it was Satisfaction. All 5 stations on the 5 buttons were playing Satisfaction. We knew they'd broken America.
We're selling our music back to American boys who probably never even heard of the people who we copied half of it from. This was in the beginning, but I suppose influences, yes. We're selling our influences back, our way of doing it. Maybe it's more acceptable the way we do it.
you have to appreciate that as the 60s developed, the national newspapers, which had now taken rock and roll to its front pages, became more and more interested in rock stars. So therefore they'd spent years being utilised by people like Andrew Oldham to build up their artists. So now they were interested in trying to bring them down. Typical, and it's a situation that still exists today. Now the band's obviously been using drugs since before they became famous in varying shapes and forms. However, there were journalists hanging out backstage who were trying to find out were they just smoking, were they doing a line of coke, what were they doing? What pills were they popping? So as it got to 66 and 67, the interest in the national newspapers grew to the extent that the police were working hand in hand with the national newspapers. So it so happens that when the News of the World raided Keith's cottage with Mick Innitt and Marion Faithfull, who was there outside with them but the News of the World reporter and photographer. So it was a marriage between what the newspapers thought society wanted to read and also part of their campaign to destroy the rock acts. So it got heavier and heavier.
Well, do you think you have now encouraged your fans to take drugs?
I don't think it'll make any difference, you know. I don't think my fans are going to take drugs just because I did.
Brian's biggest problem is the drugs he were taking were probably far more lethal than the rest of the Stones. They had different reactions to different drugs, and whatever Mick and Keith were taking, Brian wasn't. So therefore you had people on a different path. Mick and Keith had no problem with Charlie because Charlie was on his own trip. Bill Wyman followed. But it soon became apparent he just wasn't in the right place. There were occasions when Brian hadn't turned up at the studio, pulling the great I am or I'm incapable, which was more likely to be as his drug abuse developed. So yes, he would turn up at the studio one night and they'd say, right, we want you to put this part on here, we want you to play this here. And he always did it. Brian got involved with Anita Pallenberg, who took him on even further trips and mysterious journeys. The relationship changed and she felt trapped because he became violent. And Brian, the nice guy by day, became the very unpleasant person by night. Somewhere along the line, Keith just stepped in and took her away, I think initially to rescue her, but took her away, and Keith and Anita became a couple for a long period of time. And I don't think Brian ever forgave him for it. Mick's relationship with Marion Faithfull. Well, Andrew made a record with her called As Tears Go By, which was paid for by Lionel Bart, dear Lionel. Lionel didn't realise this was the B-side. Or, just correction, Lionel thought this was the B-side. The A-side was some horrific 3/4 time song called I Don't Know Why or I Don't Know How. It was so bad, I don't want to remember the title. And they knocked off this B-side, which was As Tears Go By, which was a song written by Mick with Jim Sullivan, although it's credited to Jagger, Richards and Oldham. And it was knocked off very quickly as a B-side in the last 20 minutes of the session. Andrew had spent a week every night going round to Mick and Keith working on the arrangement, and as time goes by it became As Tears Go By. When that cor anglais came in, I went, oh,
and I felt the hairs on the back of my hands stand up. I thought, this is a smash. And then that voice coming, it is the evening. I thought, oh, this is fabulous. Loved it. And then Andrew just got disenchanted with her. It was a very heavy drug period. Mick and Keith had been busted. Brian had been busted. We were told by the police guy that had arrested Mick and Keith, or I was told, that they were coming for Andrew next and he was going to fit him up. Andrew couldn't take anymore. He was on the verge of a drug-induced breakdown and left the country. They were playing gigs, and of course the blues type gigs that you played, you were mixing with guys that smoked, and then if you were at the all-nighter, you were dealing with jazz musicians that were very heavily into smack.
Yeah, there were lots of new sounds, but I can't even remember what they are, but there was no one particular thing that I thought was the start of some really big movement. They're all just little things going on their own, and then they just fade away. But people like Hendrix and other people were already happening, and all the people I think happened in '67, people really all knew about. The ones that I liked anyway, there probably were others.
Do you think the Rolling Stones progressed as a group?
Not particularly. We did a lot, but I don't think we progressed, because I don't think progression exists. There's no progression. There's only sort of forwards and backwards don't really exist, because you don't know if you're going forwards or backwards or sideways. You could go backwards to right to where you began, where you might be going forwards.
It's your new music, the type of sound you want to hear.
It was the Stones music. I quite enjoy listening to it. But it's only just one facet of what we like to do. You know, the album that we've just done. It's just one kind of thing. I don't want to do that at all. You know, I don't think I want to do that kind of thing anymore.
Andrew went to the first week or so of Satanic Majesties, and that's when everything came to a head. They were going on a path that Andrew knew he couldn't go on. Andrew actually had the ability to realise that if he went that path, he wouldn't survive. Mick, I think, he could outsmart them all. Keith became the devil for a while. Brian got on a journey or a trip which really you could see was self-destructive, and there was only one end. The drug situation was there from day one, and that everybody smoked dope. And everybody smoked hash. Much later, the grass arrived from Thailand. Brian lived in a world of his own. The drugs had taken over. There was no reality. A lot of pills, a lot of acid, and probably smack at that time. From what one knows of Brian's early life, maybe the music business was not the best business to be in. Maybe to be in a band that became so important and so big as the Rolling Stones was his wrong choice of band. Maybe he should have just played blues with Alexis Korner, who was like the godfather of the band, the musical godfather.
Let's face it, the future as a Rolling Stone is very uncertain.
I've heard stories that Brian was forming the supergroup with Jimmy and John Lennon. We've all heard these whisper stories and little bits in magazines over the... Again, it becomes rock and roll folklore. I'm sure anybody of Jimmy's ability and John Lennon's ability would only have to jam with Brian for a couple of hours to realise the guy had become a passenger. Once he got a whiff or hold of any chemicals that were going, in a way that was the beginning of a very fast end.
My ultimate aim in life was never to be a pop star. I enjoy it, with reservations, but I'm not really sort of satisfied, either artistically or personally. Oh, I have a lot of regrets, but generally speaking, no. I'm very satisfied with what's happened.
I firmly believe that today that Andrew is not given the true recognition for what he did for most people in the industry today. His imagery of Mick Jagger and then the devil in Keith Richards set up rock and roll to get it onto the front page of the newspapers. It became television news, it became newspaper news, and it set a standard people have tried to copy and follow. Many have followed. I don't think anybody really surpassed what was achieved in that 64 to 65 period. It was number one after number one, you know, Get Off of My Cloud, Satisfaction, 19th Nervous Breakdown. I mean, these are classic rock and roll, pop rock and roll records. You know, the older people go to see the Stones concert and they wait for the old hits, because quite frankly, the hits that Andrew produced with them weren't necessarily the greatest records of all time, but each record was a statement. And it's a statement that the Stones have come to live by, and it's a statement that everybody's copied and followed since. The parting of the ways between the Stones and Brian Jones was regretted at the time and expected, and when you look back at it, you realise it had to happen. Brian had fallen apart emotionally and physically. Sure, we encouraged Mick and Keith, but they'd also realised that Brian had been left behind. The Stones had moved on, he'd become a liability. And really, in a way, it was quite a unique situation that you actually got rid of a member of the band. You didn't really do that at that time. So they fired him. As I understand it, it was Mick and Keith that told Brian he had to go. In a way, as I was told by Andrew, Brian took it as relief. And the atmosphere, once he left or was out, changed dramatically. But you just somehow felt that Brian wasn't long for this world.
Brian and I had drifted apart, and I was living under the impression that because Brian's dream had become a reality and that the band was extremely successful, that Brian was, you know, very happy. I feel anger at the fact that the two people who should have been there protecting him and, you know, taking care of him were actually the two people who were taking the band away from him.
Brian's drug abuse was so appalling, he was incapable of playing. And he wasn't really fired, he was just told goodbye. He was, you know, it just happened that he was no longer available as a competent human being to turn up to record or to play. I understand it was Mick and Keith that said to him, look, old chap, time's up.
He had asthma as well. So to use a nebulizer, he made a big effort, like he would do it in the middle of a take. It was his form of grandstanding and, look, I need attention. Mick and Keith were the wrong people to ask for attention from.
Jimi Hendrix was very, very special. Andrew had a female friend called Linda Keith, whose father was a broadcaster on BBC called Brian Keith. And we were all in New York, and Linda said, come to this club tonight, I want to show you an absolute sensation. Now, Brian was seeing Linda, and Andrew was absolutely off his face. And Jimi Hendrix came on and played what I would say was one of the greatest sets I've ever seen in my life. Absolutely phenomenal. All the hits were in the act, the guitar behind his head, the Light of Fury, everything was in there. And I said to Andrew, we've got to sign him. And he said, can't sign him. This was his big mistake. Can't sign him, he said, because guitarists will never be that focal point. I said, I think you're wrong. He later said the real problem was he knew that Linda was seeing Jimmy and seeing Brian at the same time. And I suppose in his own mind he realised his loyalties had to be to Brian. So it was a no-go before we even got there. A couple of months later we get a call from Eric Clapton and he says, you've got to come tonight, we've got a great guest artist. So fine, we went. And Eric does this thing in the middle of their set, saying about how great this next guy is, and out comes Jimi Hendrix, who plays the same set. Absolutely magnificent. I can't find, it was real rock and roll. And I said to Andrew, we should have signed him. He said, I've never seen him before in my life.
November 1968. Brian purchased the beautiful country home belonging to A.A. Milne, author of Winnie the Pooh. Perhaps Jones realised the damage the drugs were doing to his body and mind and was trying to find a sanctuary away from the limelight. Just 3 weeks after being fired from the Rolling Stones, he is found dead in his swimming pool. To this day, the jury is out on whether he accidentally drowned or was murdered over a pay dispute with his builder, the last person to see Brian alive. The Rolling Stones were booked to do a concert in Hyde Park that still went ahead despite Brian's death only a few days earlier.
Concert in the Park for Brian was pretty sick. Mick letting off the Doves, reading some Shelley. It was a charade, really.
Oh, Brian will be at the concert. I mean, he'll be there. I mean, it all depends what you believe in. If you don't, agnostic, he's just dead and that's it. When we get there this afternoon, I mean, he's going to be there. I don't believe in Western bereavement. You know, I can't suddenly drape the long black veil and walk the hills, but it still is very upsetting. I want to make it so that Brian's send-off from the world is filled with as much happiness as possible.
The tribute to Brian in Hyde Park was a marketing ploy for the Stones to move on to the next stage in their career, put them back in the limelight, absolve themselves from any public guilt. Mick wearing the frock designed by Ozzy Clarke, the frock dress. It was pure television, great theatre.
Listen, yeah. Who's introducing this? Listen, the first thing that's going to happen is when we get on the stage, I'm going to read something which is for Brian, and because we all want to think about him today, and so the first thing that's going to happen is I'm going to read something which is for Brian, and I hope they all agree with what I say about it. But can you say that so they're prepared for it? Yes. Because otherwise, you know, it might be difficult for them to shut up.
Yeah. It's a very nice crowd. I mean, everyone's obviously very happy, but I reckon it's reckoned at 650,000.
No.
The Rolling Stones, with varying lineups, will continue their success over a 40-year span, and as of 2008 are still going strong, while other bands from their generation have long since retired. Brian Jones may have started the band, but Mick, Keith and Charlie would seal their place in history books.